it's very loud. I think this is the strange echo. Okay, so I'm Hal. I do language-related stuff. So that's what I'm going to talk about. And I guess like feel free to ask me questions whenever. We can like make this reasonably informal. Right. So okay. So I do natural language processing. So what is that? That's roughly trying to get computers to be adept at using human language. So this can range from like fairly low-level tasks, like things like spell correction, text categorization, like is this document about news or sports or whatever, to relatively high-level things like dialogue systems or machine translation or question answering or something like that. So I guess just to sort of like set the stage and make sure we're all on the same page. So, you know, if you want to know what anything is, you go to Wikipedia. So I want to know what language is. So somehow it's this ability to use like complex systems of communication in order to like transmit information. Right, and the people who study language are linguists. And there's really sort of like two threads of like ways in which language and like computer science intersect. So not everyone sort of makes this distinction exactly this way, but I generally think of like computational linguistics as I want to do what a linguist would do, but I want to use computers to make it, to do it better or do it differently. So this is sort of like an analogy to like computational biology. The goal there is to study biological processes by like means of computational devices. And so computational linguistics is sort of the parallel thing. And this tends to be sort of like the more like science-y version. And then there's like NLP, which is the more like engineering-y discipline, which is just try to like build things that are interesting that do like cool things with language. And then there's sort of like related fields. So there's like speech processing technology. And then like historically, this is also sometimes been called human language technology. So I will talk mostly about NLP. I'll sort of like try to highlight some like more CL stuff as we go along, but this is like 90% of what I do. So yeah, so that's what I'm going to talk about. I guess NLP broadly is often conceived of as like a subdiscipline of AI. And there have been like a bunch of useful success cases. So like a bunch of years ago now, IBM Watson competed on Jeopardy and won a bunch of money for charity, beating out Ken Jennings, who was the winningest Jeopardy player at the time. So then in some work that we did here, like, so there's this other trivia game called Quiz Bowl, which like trivia buffs think is like much more important than Jeopardy. So the thing with Jeopardy is that like Alex Trebek reads the question and you can't buzz in until the question is over. And so it turns out that like among the like top level performers in Jeopardy, they pretty much all know the answer to pretty much every question. And so it becomes just a game of who can buzz in fastest. In Quiz Bowl, you can buzz in whenever you want during the question. So it's set up so that like the more esoteric knowledge you know, the earlier you can buzz in. So anyway, so we built a system for playing Quiz Bowl. This is also Ken Jennings playing against our system. And we also beat Ken Jennings. So I feel a little bit bad for Ken because now he's like this poster child for like getting beat by question answering systems. To be fair, so Ken actually like played and coached Quiz Bowl, but he hadn't played it in quite some time at the point that we had this little exhibition. We've since played against like top high school teams, and they can still routinely beat our system. So, which I guess possibly means they can probably beat Ken too. But it's somehow more impressive if we beat Ken than if we beat like 4 high school students, but the high school students are actually a much harder competitor. So there's things like that. There's like Google Translate. There's speech recognition on your phone. There's ETS. So ETS does like the SATs and the GREs and stuff like that. So yeah, I don't know if people know this, but like a lot of the essay grading is done automatically. So the way that your essays are graded is they're given to one human judge and they're given to one computer judge, and they both give you a score between, I think it's like 1 and 5. And if the difference between the scores is less than 1 point, then they just go with that score. And if the difference in scores is greater than 1 point, then they get a second human to come in and like adjudicate. There's apparent, I don't think ETS does this, but there are other companies where like all of it is done by computers, which I think is like terrifying because we are not nearly good enough at this task for this to be automated. There was also this like interesting anecdote at ETS. So it used to be that there were 2 people and then a third adjudicated if there was more than a point difference. And one of the things that happened was like, so you're supposed to give like 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, and people would start only giving 2, 3, or 4 because it increased the chances that they agreed with the other person. But then ETS doesn't want that because they actually want people to give 1s and 5s, so they had to like correct and force people to give 1s and 5s. Anyway, so these things sort of work in a lot of cases. So I guess like one of the ways I like thinking about language is like, what would it mean to design a language? So, you know, everyone in this room, I assume, speaks one language at least. Some people speak multiple, which you learned, but you didn't design, right? So like people do design languages professionally. Like if you watch Game of Thrones, there's like 2 or 3 invented languages there. I think the oldest invented language was like, there was this monk back in like the 1400s who decided to try to invent a language that was totally unambiguous. And the result was that to like say something like, I'm sitting on a chair took like 5 pages of text because you just had to like specify everything. So there's a lot of stuff that like goes into like what you need to do if you want to design a language. So you'd have to design what like the sound system is like. You'd have to decide whether it's like a voiced language or a signed language. You'd have to decide various properties of like how words go together. You'd have to decide the lexicon, and so on. And so like the study of like what makes different languages different is broadly called linguistic typology. So here's an example. So there's this really nice resource called the World Atlas of Language Structures that it's a database of about 2,100 languages and about 150 linguistic properties. So here, this is a map of what order the language prefers between verbs and objects. So do I say, like in English, which is verb object, I say like, I saw the cat. In Japanese, which is object verb, I say, I the cat saw. Right, and the languages over here are not English. This is like Native American languages, English is over here. Okay, so does anyone speak a language that's object verb? What language? Oh, so like, right, so like so do I say, like basically do I put verbs at the end of the sentence or not? So, right, so in English verbs go in the middle, so the only object verb language I know is Japanese, so there the verbs pretty much always go at the end. No one speaks it's like half of the languages. Who speaks a language that's a blue dot?
Yes, I do.
You do?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay, so I'm going to guess that in whatever language that is, adjectives come before nouns. So you say like, red balloon, not balloon red. Am I right or wrong? You can tell me if I'm wrong. Yeah, I'm right? Okay, awesome. So there's correlation between these properties. So I don't have the adjective one, so I have, so adpositions. So in English we have prepositions, right? We say like dog with ball. In Japanese, you have postposition, so you say like ball with dog. So the with goes after ball rather than before ball. So English is prepositional, so it's a red dot. Japanese is postpositional, so it's a blue dot. And so if I go like back and forth between these, you might notice that like the red dots are kind of red dots and the blue dots are kind of blue dots. So there's this really strong correlation between languages that are verb object and languages that have prepositions like English, and languages that are object verb like Japanese tend to have postpositions. Actually English is the oddity here. So typologically English should put adjectives after nouns, but we don't. So there's always exceptions. But yeah, okay, so there's a billion properties like this. A bunch of them are correlated, but you know, just because they're correlated doesn't mean it's like a fixed rule. Yeah. For, I probably don't know any of these languages. So like, this is probably Dutch or something. So, yeah, I don't know if I could get, okay, so like in high school, I took Latin. Latin would probably have counted as no dominant order. Like you can kind of put the words wherever you want. And some of these, you know, it's unclear, right? Like in a lot of these, it's not that it has to be that way. It's just, you know, 90% of the time, this is how it goes. So for instance, in German, German tends to put verbs in the middle, but in certain constructions, verbs go at the end. I think German is one of these red dots, so I think it's still counted as verb object. Okay, so if you want to have fun with languages, so there's this nice project in the linguistics department here called Wingscake, which has a map of about 6,000 or 7,000 languages. You can like zoom in, find where different languages are spoken, and like learn various properties. So in general, like, I mean, it's always hard like defining what's a language and what's a dialect, but like depending on how you count, people will generally say there's between like 7,000 and 10,000 living languages. About 600 of them have written tradition. A lot of them have adopted like other written traditions now. And if you take like the top 100, this covers about 95% of the world population. So that sounds like kind of good from like a technology perspective. Like if I can make technology for 100 languages, I've covered like 95% of the world. But then there's like this flip side, which is, so English speakers are about 5% of the world. If you include like second language English speakers, this goes up to about 14 or 15%. But about like over half of the data on the web is in English. So you have this like big disparity between like what languages people speak and what languages are available. So I was in this like kind of odd situation like a year ago where I was on this panel for the president of Iceland. So I'd never met a president of a country before. I thought that was pretty cool. I also looked up Iceland's population. It's like pretty small. So, but so the thing that this was part of this larger thing where in Iceland they're very concerned about like losing Icelandic speakers. So one of the things that happens is like, especially with things like social media, like the younger generation in Iceland pretty much will do all of their communication in English, because if they want it to be understood by more than just like the couple 100,000 people who live in Iceland or Denmark, if they write something in Icelandic, it's not going to be like accessible to the world. So you also have like this big sort of like language preservation issue around this sort of like English web dominance. So I guess sort of this disparity is like one of the big arguments for looking at machine translation, which I'm going to talk a bit about sort of for the rest. So, so machine translation started in like the late 40s. So this is Warren Weaver. His sort of idea was to think of machine translation as code breaking. So think about this in the context of like World War II and then eventually leading into the Cold War, which is why he's talking about Russian. So he was a cryptographer, and he basically sort of had this model of like, okay, Russian, it was like someone was trying to speak English, but then they ran it through some cipher, and then what came out was Russian. And so like all of this stuff that I've learned about how to like decipher encoded messages, let's think about using that for building translation systems. So that was sort of the idea in the late 40s. In like the 1950s, there was this experiment between Georgetown and IBM where they built a machine translation system that captured 250 words and had 6 grammatical rules in it, which, today this is not impressive, but back then this was, like this giant enterprise because like computers really didn't exist very much. And then in 1966, there was this ALPAC report, which basically said like all of this, like basically this said like Warren Weaver's idea is garbage. This essentially led to no more funding in translation, at least in the United States, for like several decades. So then in 1988, the speech processing group at IBM decided to sort of revisit the Warren Weaver idea and think about machine translation from this like statistical code breaking sense rather than like this rule-based sense which it kind of dominated. So they wrote this paper, Statistical Approach to Machine Translation. It starts off in this paper, we present a statistical approach to machine translation. We describe the application of our approach to translation from French to English and give preliminary results. So they submitted this to this conference, Colang, which at the time was like kind of one of the top 2 conferences in NLP. And one of the reviews came back saying the validity of the statistical approach to MT has indeed been recognized, as the authors mentioned, by Weaver as early as 1949, and was universally recognized as mistaken by 1950. This is not science, this is beyond the scope of the conference. So this paper then eventually did get published elsewhere. It's probably the most cited paper in all of like natural language processing. And it really like set off like the statistical revolution in NLP. There was a workshop a couple years ago called 20 Years of Bitext, which came out 20 years, so I guess it was in 2008. Okay, that was more than a couple years ago now, wow. And so they invited they invited all of the authors back, not all of them came. But there was this speech, basically there was a speech by Peter Brown, and so a lot of these people, after they did this, they went and founded a hedge fund company. Some of them became very rich. You may recognize this person's name. He's a bit infamous these days, but he's very wealthy and donates lots of money. So what happened then was like people got really excited about the statistical approach. Around 2010, these products became commercially viable. And then since then, we've been like moving to like these neural network models of translation. So how do these things work? So I get a bunch of text that's been translated by people from one language to another. So the initial example was the Canadian Hansard. So this is the like official government transcript in Canada, which because of Quebec needs to be parallel in English-French. And then I basically segment this into comparable segments, so roughly like sentence to sentence translations. I throw this through some like machine learning system that tries to find correspondences between the English text and the French text to generalize new sentences. So this works reasonably well. So here's an example for Chinese to English. So I can't read Chinese, so I guess I can't really tell you whether this is accurate or not. But I'm told it's accurate, so you get something like reporters learned from the Ministry of Environmental Protection, water 10 requirements before the end of this year, before municipality, the provincial capital city plans to build a separate city. So this is like, it kind of sounds like English, like you can kind of tell what's going on, but it's definitely not like a perfect translation. You couldn't like publish this in a newspaper, for instance. Even French English, which tends to be a lot easier because they're much more typologically similar. So here you get something like, at the beginning of this televised debate, which was unheard of in the history of the Fifth Republic, tout sur Macron was expected, but it was the candidate of the National Front who found itself at the heart of the first attacks of the four opponents in one evening, favored by the first theme tackled, the issues of society and the security, immigration, secularism. So this is, I think, clearly a lot better. And a lot of this is like A, because we have more data for French English, and B, because French and English are just much more similar, which makes life a lot easier. So, okay, so why is this stuff hard? So it's largely hard because of ambiguity. So these are like headlines from newspapers. Headlines often have funny ambiguities because they leave out words to get brief. So my favorite is enraged cow injures farmer with axe. So somehow the intention is that it's the farmer who has the axe, but like the default read of this, like it sounds like the cow has the axe. Or kids make nutritious snacks. So these are not hard to find. Like you can look around not too long and find lots of examples of cases where there's legitimate ambiguity, and this ambiguity is really hard to resolve. So hence the anecdote about the monk who wanted to make the unambiguous language. Okay, so machine translation is starting to work. So then we asked ourselves the question, like, okay, we're academics, we don't work on things that work, we work on things that don't work. So what doesn't work? So what doesn't work is simultaneous interpretation. So simultaneous interpretation is like translation, but you have to do it at the same time that someone else is speaking. So this actually was invented for the Nuremberg trials, and it was invented because there were a bunch of defendants, they all spoke different languages. If you did consecutive translation, where one person speaks and then it's translated, and then they speak and then it's translated, they did like a back of the envelope calculation that the trials would last like 20 years or something like that. So they essentially had to invent simultaneous interpretation as a way of like making the trial process briefer. So I have an example video. I hope the audio plays. So this is from a court setting. This is a training video, so it's a little bit awkward, but.
You have the right to remain silent. Anything that you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Do you understand that?
Sí. Yes.
You also have the right to counsel. If you're unable to afford counsel, this court will appoint counsel.
Okay, so you get the idea, right? So the interpreter is speaking as the judge is speaking in order to make this conversation reasonably fluent. So this is another example. This is actually a real life example. So this is Daniel Green, who's interpreting for this talk by Joanna Blackwood.
What kind of ownership area? All artists steal from all artists.
So my one experience with, or I guess I've had two experiences being interpreted. Both cases were into ASL, and it's really quite impressive. And like the way that I could kind of tell how lagged behind me the interpreter was like I would tell a joke, and then I could see how long it took for the audience to laugh. And it was generally about like half a second. Like it was really quite fast. So if you don't speak another language, like imagining what it's like to simultaneous interpret something is really hard. But there's this thing that monolingual speakers can do that you can all try. So this is called shadowing. So in shadowing, what you do is like you turn on the TV, and you watch the program and you try to repeat back exactly what the person says with as little delay as possible. So there's no translation, it's just like basically echo the person speaking. Okay, so I'm gonna make you do it. You can do it under your breath. I'll give you a little bit of context because context helps. So this is a talk about neural machine translation. By Margaret Costayusa, who's at UPC in Barcelona. So you don't have to talk loudly, but try it just for like a couple sentences.
Now let's start with neural machine translation. Okay, we have seen language modeling, which is quite related to neural machine translation. It's like the previous step to that. Let's go into to see this neural machine translation application. As before, I'm going to make an overview problem of machine translation. Okay, the way it has been approached.
Okay, so it's hard. The thing that's kind of amazing is that, at least in your native language, most people with a couple of hours of practice can do this with about a 1 to 2 syllable delay, which is about half a second. So I've tried, I lost patience, but it's apparently possible. There's actually a lot of studying of shadowing. So like one of the things you can do if you're a linguist. So there's okay. So for instance, like what's the holiday called where kids dress up in costumes and they walk around and give out candy? Halloween. So what did I do wrong? So I said the kids give out candy. The kids don't actually give out candy. The kids get candy. So this is called a linguistic illusion. So somehow you didn't notice that, or most people don't notice that. And if you're shadowing, you will often shadow the wrong thing. Like you'll shadow what you're expecting, not what you actually hear. Because if you think about it, like half of a second is an amazingly short amount of time for like something to go into your ear, get processed by your brain, and then come out your mouth. And so like your brain is doing an immense amount of anticipation of what's coming up when you get good at this, and shadowing is a way of like studying this from a linguistics perspective. All right, so so we worked a bit on simultaneous machine interpretation. So this is my with students who's now faculty at NYU, and Alvin, who's faculty at Ursinus. Okay, so this problem's really hard. Like one of the reasons is because languages put words in different orders. So I'm using like Japanese as an example here, but I've written it with English words. So like in Japanese, if you want to say the man went to the store, you say something like man store go. If you want to say something like the man who wanted to buy food went to the store, you say food by man store go. So what this means is that if I'm interpreting from Japanese to English, after I've said the man, I have to wait for the Japanese speaker to say the verb before I can continue. And that's not so bad in this sentence. It's, I guess if this modifier were on store, not on man, so it's a terrible example. But if the sentence were something like, the man went to the store located in the next town, then you would get something like, the man located in the next town store go. And so you have to wait like this immense amount of time before you get the verb, which means you're kind of just hanging out, like not doing anything. So what we wanted to do initially was like look at what do human interpreters do in order to get around this issue. Because human interpreters are not just sitting there waiting for the verbs to come, they have some way of like coping with this. And the eventual goal was like, can we sort of like replicate these strategies? So the way we did this was we took a collection of TED Talks that had been interpreted live into English from Japanese, and then we post hoc had those translated with someone who was not trying to do this like simultaneously. And so by comparing these two translations, we can look at the difference between what do people do when they have sort of arbitrary amounts of time to translate versus what do people do when they have to do this in like an online fashion. Okay, so here's an example. So this was the original Japanese sentence. The person who had unlimited time to translate translates this as they might recognize expression 1, but not expression 2 to 4. The interpreter says the phrase number 1 only is accepted, and phrases 2, 3, and 4 were not accepted. So literally what's going on here is let's see, so where is it? So, I mean, basically the interpreter is following the Japanese word order, whereas the batch translator has, right, so the interpreter is using accepted twice because they get it early and then they get it late, whereas the batch translator has merged these into one thing. So there's a bunch of things that people do. So one is that they generalize terms. So here the Japanese says honorific, but the interpreter says polite. So one of the reasons this might happen is because the amount of time that it takes your brain to retrieve a word is roughly inversely proportional to its frequency. So retrieving the word honorific is going to take you a lot more time than retrieving the word polite, and maybe this is sufficient for this context. They also often split sentences, so this was just one sentence in Japanese, but they split it into two sentences to interpret. And then you also get sort of, this is another generalization, so instead of saying adequately, they say enough. What else do they do? So sometimes they just drop things. So the source does literally say spoken Japanese. So Japanese is here, but they just drop this in the interpretation, probably because it was clear from context. And then instead of saying as much as possible, they say very, and in this case it's because they're kind of running behind and they need to catch up. And so they use a shorter phrase. So there's a bunch of stuff that goes on. So there's sort of these sentence inversions, like in the first example. There's segmentation into multiple sentences. There's the word generalization. And then sometimes there's this summarization or omission to catch up. So we kind of wanted to model this. So the way we thought about this was okay, we're going to build a model for doing simultaneous interpretation. And the way that this is going to work is we're going to assume that we're sort of at a clock, and at every time step, I can either wait to hear more words from the speaker, or I can start speaking. And if I'm going to speak, I can do one of two things. I can either translate what I've already heard, or I can try to anticipate. And I can try to either anticipate what the next word is going to be. So this is the Halloween example, or I can try to guess what the eventual verb is going to be. So one of the things that interpreters love to do is they love content-free English verbs. So in a business context, the word promote is very popular among interpreters because promote doesn't really mean anything. You can kind of just stick it in the middle of the sentence and then fix things up later. So another example of this is if I know we're talking about travel and someone says I flew to Japan yesterday, but flew comes at the end, an interpreter might say, I went to Japan yesterday by plane. So when you finally hear the flew, you kind of semi-correct for the earlier ambiguity. So okay, I'm going to switch to a German example. So we have a sentence like, Ich bin mit dem Zug nach Ulm gefahren, which glosses as I am with the train to Ulm traveled, which means I traveled by train to Ulm. So we're going to sort of assume that at some point in the translation process, we've heard the speaker say mit dem Zug. We have some model that's guessing both what the next word is going to be. So it thinks the next word is und, which is incorrect. And it thinks that the verb is going to be gewesen, which is also incorrect. And so in this case, we hope that the system chooses to wait to get more information. So now it hears two more words. So it hears bin ich. It thinks the final verb is going to be geliefert. It thinks the next word is going to be nur. So maybe it chooses to wait again. And then at this point, it's heard enough that it's guessing that the final verb is going to be gefahren, which is correct. And so we then use this in the context of a normal machine translation system to, let's see, where is it? To produce the initial part of the translation. So at this point, I haven't heard Gefähren yet, but I think I'm going to hear Gefähren, so I pretend like I heard it, and then I translate the sort of hypothesized sentence. And then I repeat this to the end, and then I finally translate everything. So we can build this system, we can train it based on like what human interpreters do. Evaluation is really hard, so here we have some metric that I won't tell you about, but I'll just tell you bigger numbers are better. So this is right, and the important thing about the metric is that it takes into account both the speed at which you interpret and the correctness of the interpretation. So actually, maybe the next one is just easier to see. So this is as I go through the sentence. So this red curve is a system that just waits till the end and then translates the whole thing. So it's really, really bad until the end of the sentence, and then it's quite good. The blue thing is something that basically translates every word as it comes. So it doesn't get to wait at all. So it actually does quite well immediately, but then toward the end it starts getting worse because it's like overcommitted to stuff that's wrong. Whereas this thing that we learned, so that's the purple one, it starts off a little bit behind because it's like waiting to hear more later, but then by the end of the sentence it ends up doing sort of better overall. So you get this trade-off between like simultaneity and accuracy. Okay, so yeah, so this kind of worked. This was, I don't know, 4 years ago. There's been a bunch of other people who have now blown this out of the water. So it works a lot better now, but I think it was a fun project at the time. So what we've kind of moved on to was like, instead of thinking about replacing human interpreters, let's just help them out. So this is one of those nice cases where like human ability and machine ability are nicely different. So humans understand context really well. And so if you actually go talk to an interpreter, they will, in general, be very clear that their job is not to translate, their job is to interpret. So if there's like cultural knowledge that's embedded in the source speech, they consider it part of their job to convey the appropriate cultural knowledge in the target language. So to some degree, it's a lot more than just doing translation. Humans are also pretty robust to noise. They know the audience, they often know the speaker. They're really good at making these repairs. Like a lot of people have tried to figure out how to get systems to do repairs. It seems really, really hard. And then humans can also communicate with much more than words. So like using tone of voice, speed, stuff like that, we communicate a lot. On the other hand, like machines are great because they don't get tired. So human interpreters generally work in pairs where one person will interpret for like 15 or 20 minutes, then they'll switch off because the first person's brain needs a break. So humans get cognitively overloaded, they can forget things, so like human short-term memory isn't that great, and machines can look stuff up quickly. So so we had a couple of projects looking at helping interpreters. So this is mostly with Joe Shoemaker, who's here, and Craig Stewart, who just graduated from CMU. He's at Unbabel now, which is like a machine translation company. So what we started with was going and talking to interpreters to find out what they want. So I think if there's one thing I've learned over like the past 5 years, it's like before you build a system for someone, you should talk to them and like see what they actually need. It's actually quite hard to do surveys with interpreters, so I'll talk about this a little bit later, but this was based on survey and interview with 18 interpreters. Some were students, some were professionals. And we were really looking at like, how receptive are interpreters to tools? Like, do they actually want like a computerized system? Can we help them with like building glossaries? How does this affect their performance and their job satisfaction? And then what are the limits of like tools given current technological limitations? So interpreters generally break their workflow down into 3 steps. So there's like preparation, then actual live interpretation, and then like post hoc analysis. So in preparation, basically everyone except like, I don't know, 2 or 3 people, to prepare, they go and gather content. So like a common thing to do here is like, if you know that you're going to interpret a talk by me, you will go to YouTube and you will try to find talks by me on a similar topic, so you can learn like what vocabulary I use and what terminology I use and just how I speak. So 60% of people will prepare a glossary. Lots will look for technical docs. So if I'm giving a talk at a conference, it will often be based on a paper, so they'll go read the paper, or like past talks by me. So this is a quote from one of the participants. So they think it's really important to get familiarized with the speaker's accent and style. One thing like anecdotally that came across really clearly from interpreters is they hate when people read prepared speeches, because when you're speaking extemporaneously, there's a lot of gaps, there's a lot of filled pauses like and this all gives like the interpreter a chance to catch up. Whereas if I'm reading a prepared speech, like the information density is just super high and the interpreter like hates it. So if you're ever giving a talk and you're being interpreted, don't have a prepared speech. It sounds like they would like this, but they hate it. Okay, so then during interpretation, so one of the things that a bunch of people mentioned was difficult was getting materials ahead of time. So again, if you're gonna give a talk and be interpreted, send them your stuff like a week in advance. And then we asked them for a bunch of different things. How hard are these things for you? And like, what would you want help with? So this is like sorted, I don't care to I care a lot. So like 90% of people find numbers challenging. So numbers are one of these things that, you know, in principle, this should be easy to interpret. But if I say like, you know, yesterday, the Dow Jones rose by $2,372.62, blah, 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 blah. And then you have to regurgitate that number. You're going to be like, oh, I don't remember that number. Especially if you're interpreting between languages that put like the decimal point in different places. Yeah, or the comma in different places. It's super hard. So they really want help with dates, numbers, names of people, a little bit less with names of places and names of organizations. A lot of people use reference texts during interpretation. About half use electronic devices. This is definitely correlated with age, so younger interpreters tend to use electronic devices more. Some people even said that like when they're working with a buddy and it's their buddy's turn to interpret, like they'll play Candy Crush because they just need their brain to like defocus. Yeah, so then there's stuff that interpreters do as buddies. So I actually really like this idea. So, okay, so if my partner is struggling, I'll write a suggested translation. I'll use my hand to cover what I wrote. After my partner saw my hand gesture, he or she will know that I wrote something down. If they need the information, they can look down and I'll reveal the answer. This is the least intruding way for my partner. So I thought this was really interesting because like, they're trying to strike this balance between providing information, but not like overloading the buddy, right? So like, one of the things is like, I could fill a screen with information, but if this is just cognitively overloading you even more, like you're just gonna shut off the screen. Yeah, so I guess no one said they play Candy Crush, but, okay, well someone did, but not as part of the interview. And then after an interpretation, so most people will go back over and listen to their interpretation. A bunch will do some sort of self-evaluation and some will update their own glossaries. So I was actually kind of surprised by this. So like when I give talks, I hate listening to myself giving a talk. Like I find that incredibly terrifying. But this is something that they do to like improve their skills. So pretty much everyone records and they'd love help like trying to find places where they were making errors and stuff like that. So what do they want help with? So this is on a scale from 1 to 10, where 1 is I really want it, 10 is I could care less. So one thing that people generally want is they want help with like very specific terms. So they want help with names, they want help with dates and numbers, and they want help with individual key terms. And then a couple of things that people definitely don't want is they don't want to just see a transcript of what the speaker is saying. They really don't want to see a translation of a transcript of what the speaker is saying. And they don't want sort of like distracting information like biographical information or full text documents, because it's just too much to look at. So, okay, so then we started thinking about like, okay, so how can we support these needs? So this is a little system mock-up. So this is imagined as sort of like a heads-up display for an interpreter. So you could imagine things like, maybe I'll give you a little bit of, this is supposedly English to Spanish, so I'll give you a little snippet of what the English was, and in particular a word that you might find challenging. Maybe trench is a better example than deep. And then I give you the translation of that word. And then for numbers, it's sort of more obvious. You can just set the number. And then the idea would be that, like, if you like it, maybe you tap it. If you don't like it, you swipe it or something like that. So I had this like funny situation. I was home for Christmas, and I was talking to my mom about this project. So my mom hates technology. She's perfectly adept at technology, she just really doesn't like it. So we were talking about all these things like, oh, we can infer, like, if the speaker is struggling, we can tell by their tone of voice that, like, they need help, and then we can give them more information. And she was like, why don't you just give them, like, a foot pedal? And, like, if they want help, they can tap the foot pedal. And I was like, it's actually a really good idea. like why are we trying to infer these things that like we could just have like a low overhead medium for collecting? So we've also looked at things sort of like by analogy to like volume control. So we have like vocab, we have numbers, we have dates, and then the person could say like, okay, I want to up the vocab on the numbers and up the volume on the numbers and like down the volume on the names or something like that. So this is all kind of ongoing, but generally we're trying to build stuff to help interpreters like before, during, and after. So Joe has been working a lot on like gathering vocabulary lists and translations and stuff like that, and then also trying to find like if they want to have a practice session with the same speaker, like can I give them little snippets that might be helpful? And then during, I think the big challenge is like, how do you provide help, but not like too much help? So this is very much ongoing, and we really don't have any good idea how to do this. And then after, I think there's a bunch of questions around interpreter review that we haven't looked at all. So there's a bunch of technical challenges. So speech recognition is not solved. It's generally still pretty hard. And so when you make speech, and in this case, you really have to do speech recognition both in the language of the original speaker and in the language that's being interpreted into, so that you can tell, like, has this part been translated already? And so, like, now we're doing speech recognition in 2 languages, and life gets really hard. We're looking a lot at, like, personalizing based on this explicit or implicit feedback. So, if someone's already translated something and they did a good job, then probably I don't need to provide them that type of help in the future. But if someone is like routinely missing numbers, maybe the system can detect like, oh, maybe I should give more help with numbers. And then lastly, sort of issues around measuring cognitive load and success rate. So if someone is really struggling and you start popping up a lot of stuff on the screen, that is going to make things much worse rather than make things better. And so trying to figure out like when the struggling is a struggling that can be helped versus when the struggling is like, I should just back off and let them catch up. And then there's like this non-technical challenge, which is human interpreters are rare, very, very skilled, and as a result, very, very expensive. So this is partially why we only got to interview 18 people. But more generally, like, you know, we want to build systems, we want to do experiments. A normal interpreter, you're probably going to pay $50, $100 an hour to participate in an experiment. You have to be pretty confident your system is working before you like embark on that journey. So we've also been looking at a lot at like, how can we use non-interpreters in interpretation-like tasks to try to get a signal. So like, one of the things that Joe has been looking at is, suppose I take a bilingual speaker, but not someone who's trained to interpret, can I invent tasks for them that are indicative of interpretation skills, but which I can just do with sort of normal bilingual speakers. Right, and like another thing for this is you can look at shadowing experiments. So if you can train people to shadow, you can invent interpretation-like tasks that more parallel shadowing than interpretation. All right, so that's basically it. So we can do a reasonable job of translating text when we have a lot of data. So for French English, German English, Chinese English, we can do okay. But for languages with not a huge amount of text, we really can't do well at all. We can try to build sort of these anticipatory methods to help with interpretation. And we've had a fair amount of success building vocabulary sheets to help interpreters during their interpretation job. There's a lot of stuff we can't do yet, so full speech-to-speech interpretation I think is like well beyond where we are today. And I think one of the things that's like important to think about here is like, what are the right target applications? So there's been a bunch of work. I guess the only deployed simultaneous interpretation system I know of is there's a system at a university in Germany where it will interpret lectures from German to English. It doesn't do English synthesis, so if you're like a student in the audience, you'll just see like super titles appear on your screen. But in some sense, I don't think this is really the case where you need it. So like, if I'm giving a talk and my talk is delayed by 5 seconds for you, I don't think this is that big of a deal. I think it's really when we're having a dialogue where being truly simultaneous makes a big difference. So I think we need to think about like, what are the right applications? There's been a lot of work on trying to leverage linguistic properties to improve performance, so especially when I don't have a lot of data. So for instance, the fact that I know that like Japanese word order and English word order differ in specific ways, I can use this to try to improve my translation models. I think there's tons of stuff to do in helping humans be better interpreters. I actually think this is like a super exciting area because I really like these problems where like we're trying to help people do stuff rather than like take over their jobs. So I think this is really interesting. In particular, one thing I'd love to sort of get at is like also how can we help in the education process. So it's very hard to teach people to be interpreters. It's very hard to grade interpretation. So like, can we automatically grade student performance, kind of like ETS? And then I think the last thing that's really hard, and this gets to sort of this like translation versus interpretation difference, is that, right, like, it's not like Japanese is just English in a different word order, right? Like, when I say a word in some language, it comes with all sorts of cultural baggage, and connotations that come along with like phrases and words and sentence structures. And if you're really gonna like push the boundary on like what does it mean to translate, like you need to capture that stuff too. And I think we're like very, very far away from this. I guess it's like a plug. So another faculty member in the department, so Maureen Karpawad, she works a lot on this last bit. So if you're interested in that, you should totally talk to her. yeah, so that's it. You can ask me any questions. Yeah.
Do you think technology like this will help with like how there's a lot of like lesser known languages are kind of dying out right now? Do you think like stuff like this will really stop like the flow of that, or like are you gonna increase it?
So this was one of the topics that came up in this Iceland panel. Right, so one of the questions was like, suppose we had like perfect translation that could translate Icelandic to any language on the planet, right? Would this be enough so that Icelandic speakers would now start producing content in Icelandic rather than in English? Now, Icelandic is not nearly dying out at this point. It's still pretty healthy. And honestly, I'm not sure. Like, I'm not sure that the only barrier is like, I want to make myself understood. Yeah, so I think it can help. I think for like, so going to like more sort of like documentary linguistics type stuff. So I think, so I guess the stuff that I know most in this space, so at University of North Texas, so Alexis Palmer is a professor there, so she works a lot on like documenting endangered languages and using like computational linguistics / NLP technology to try to help that process. I think a lot of what goes on there is more along the lines of like, how can I use these typological properties to try to do a better job of quickly like learning the structural properties of a language. So like one example I like, so Lori Levin at CMU, she has this thing called the elicitation corpus, which is about 1,000 sentences that are designed to tease apart your language structure. So I'll give you these sentences. I assume you're bilingual in 2 languages. So when I was working on this project, which was forever ago, we were doing Mabudungun, and so a lot of Mabudungun speakers were bilingual Spanish. So they would give a Spanish sentence and they'd ask the Mabudungun speaker to translate this into Mabudungun. And you know, it's things like, I see a tree, I saw a tree, you see a tree, I see 2 trees, I see many trees, right? And so it's like all these things trying to tease apart like what differences does your language make overt versus what differences are not overt in your language. And so one thing that like people have started looking at is, so for instance, right, so English has like singular and plural. Lots of languages have neither, so like Chinese, Japanese don't have singular or plural for the most part. Some languages have singular, plural, and dual, so like 2 trees is different than 5 trees. But in general, if your language doesn't have plural, it probably doesn't have dual. Just like if your language is verb final, it probably has postpositions. So the idea was starting to be like, can I use these typological properties to like help navigate what I ask people for? So if I've asked you for plural, I've decided you don't have plural, maybe I should like not bother asking you about dual, at least until I have a bunch of other things answered. So yeah, I don't know, that's kind of a long-winded answer, but I think yes and no. Yeah. So partially I basically do almost nothing with speech except for this interpretation assistance stuff. I mean, it just has to be in speech. There's no alternative. So I think there's 2 issues. So the first issue is just like, speech recognition is not perfect, right? Like, talk to Siri, you will find out very quickly that speech recognition is not perfect. And so when it makes errors, like whatever, right, like, I don't want to propose a translation of a word that was misrecognized, because this is going to be very, very frustrating for an interpreter. So you somehow want to get not just like what was said, but also like sort of some measure of confidence that this was actually transcribed correctly. And a lot of speech recognition systems don't do this very well. And then I guess the last thing is that, I mean, I think this is both a challenge and an opportunity, but right, like a lot is communicated beyond just the words, right? Like through tone of voice and things like that. And so most like commercial speech recognizers don't give you that information, right? So like the difference between I love this talk and I love this talk is like very different, but like both will come out the same for like speech recognition. But if you're trying to interpret that as a person, you either need to pick different words or you need to mimic the intonation. And so, yeah, so that's another big challenge. And then I guess like just pushing a little bit further, we've also looked a bit at interpreting to or from American Sign Language. That's super hard. So there's Hernisa Kakuri, who's in the iSchool, does a lot of stuff with sign language. It's actually quite, this is another case where like talking to people who use the technology is like super important. So I guess sort of like anecdotally, right? So like one of the properties if you're speaking ASL is you need to use your hands to speak. So one thing, if you ever visit like Gallaudet University, one thing you'll notice is pretty much every door there is automatic and it's also glass. And one of the reasons why is because if you're deaf or hard of hearing, you can't hear someone coming the other way through a door, so you want a glass door so you can see. And it's also automatic because it would be super annoying to have to stop my conversation every time I wanted to open a door to go to a different room. So a lot of these things around like, you know, if I wanted to develop a technology for doing like ASL interpretation, either into or out of ASL, I think there's a lot more like questions around like, even what form should that technology take? And then I guess the last thing that's really hard is getting data for ASL is just incredibly expensive. So there's not that much like video recorded data of people speaking ASL. All right, well, cool. If you have any other questions, feel free to send me an email or come visit. I'm on the 4th floor in this building. Happy to try to answer whatever you might want to know.
Thank you so much to Dr. Daume for holding a talk. And as a reminder, Technica will be taking place from November 9th to 10th in the Armory. So please come out to volunteer, mentor, or hack. And I think the food's outside.